The engines roared like a confession no one wanted to hear. I remember that sound, raw, metallic, defiant, before it thinned into a strange kind of stillness that didn't belong to the sky. Beneath us, the Pacific stretched without a ripple, a mirror pretending to be peace. It was the 18th of April 1943. I marked it not on any report, but in the margin of my notebook, beside one quiet word: inevitable. In the war rooms, noise had become proof of power. Radios chattered, typewriters snapped, men argued until their voices blurred into one long note of denial. Yamamoto spoke less as the months went on, and when he did, it was measured, almost surgical. "Victory bought in haste will bankrupt in time," he told us once. They nodded, but the room was already drafting speeches about destiny. Pride has its own frequency. It drowns logic long before it drowns men. I was one of the few who saw the dispatches from our code officers, the intercepted fragments, the odd pauses in enemy traffic. They formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Still, the high command waved them off. "American bluff," they said. But I'd learned that silence inside intercepted chatter is never random, it's calculation disguised as static. When I brought that up, the reply came with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. "You think too much for a soldier." Yamamoto didn't argue after that meeting. He folded his papers, thanked the room, and walked out with the same composure he carried into every impossible task. I followed him to the courtyard, where the air was heavy with the smell of oil and salt. He looked at the horizon the way a man studies a wound he can't treat. "They want noise," he said quietly, "so we'll give them thunder. But remember, the thunder never decides the storm." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every transmission felt like a heartbeat counting down to something none of us could name. I reviewed the mission plan 3 times, tracing the flight path from Rabaul to Bougainville, calculating fuel ratios, radio intervals, contingency routes. Each figure fit perfectly, and that precision frightened me more than any flaw could. Perfect plans rarely leave room for life. When the engines started at dawn, I felt the vibration through the ground before I saw the planes lift. The sky was clean, almost kind, and for a moment I thought maybe the sea would stay quiet. But silence is deceptive, it holds its breath just before it breaks. I wrote one last line in my notebook. "We are flying toward proof." I didn't know yet that proof can arrive too late to be heard. The noise was gone now, and only the silence remained, sharp enough to cut through the morning. By the next morning, the air itself felt fevered. The halls of the Naval Ministry pulsed with motion boots, telegrams, signatures flying across crisp paper. Precision had given way to performance. Inside that rush, Yamamoto's desk looked almost foreign, one fountain pen, one ruler, one folded map aligned perfectly with the table's edge. He was stillness surrounded by fire. They called him the calm admiral, not always kindly. To them, his caution sounded like dissent. I watched the council gather that afternoon, the same men who had once worshipped his daring at Pearl Harbor now circling him with restless certainty. Their uniforms gleamed, their rhetoric sharper than their strategy. "Our people need momentum," one insisted. "They need to believe." Belief had become the new currency of command, cheap to print, expensive to redeem. Yamamoto listened, hands clasped, expression unreadable. I knew what he was calculating. Oil reserves, replacement pilots, the wear rate on aircraft engines we couldn't manufacture fast enough. He'd shown me those figures once, the way a doctor shows an X-ray, detached, factual, fatal, but numbers don't stir crowds, and crowds now ruled the boardroom. "They mistake applause for victory," he murmured later. His tone wasn't bitter, just tired. "I can't paint the council as villains. Most were patriots, intelligent men trapped in the machinery they'd built. They'd lost too much to admit the arithmetic had turned against them. Every decision now carried the weight of ghosts, sons lost, reputations pledged, promises made in public broadcasts that couldn't be retracted without shame. Sunk cost had become national policy. And shame, in that era, was more dangerous than gunfire. The tension in those rooms wasn't just between strategy and spectacle, it was between truth and survival. I'd see the truth flicker in a man's eyes when Yamamoto spoke, only to watch it smothered a heartbeat later by fear of losing face. Silence settled like dust after each meeting, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of men pretending not to hear their own doubts. One evening, as we reviewed intercepted reports, Yamamoto paused over a decoded line: "Enemy morale steady, production increasing." He traced it once with his finger, then looked up at me. "They're building time," he said. "We're burning it." I wanted to ask him what he planned to do, but his gaze had drifted to the window, where the harbor lights shimmered like scattered coins. That was when I first sensed the truth. He carried the one he couldn't voice without tearing the uniform from his own back. He knew Japan could still win battles, but not the war that would follow. It wasn't cowardice that held his tongue, it was duty. The paradox of command. To protect one's nation sometimes means protecting it from itself. Outside, the sound of drums echoed from a parade ground noise celebrating a victory already fading. Inside, Yamamoto returned to his map, pencil steady, marking distances no one else wanted to measure. The council cheered momentum, he measured endurance. And between those two convictions, silence grew wide enough to lose a man in. The days that followed blurred into paperwork. Not the kind that wins wars, but the kind that preserves a record when the truth is no longer welcome. Yamamoto spent his evenings drafting letters in his own hand, each word weighed like currency, each sentence a quiet insurance against the chaos gathering beyond the walls. He kept copies of everything: fuel reports, aircraft maintenance logs, pilot rosters filed under innocuous titles. For historical review, he called them. But I knew better. These were receipts of sanity, proof that someone had measured the tide even as the others celebrated its rise. Silence became our ally. While the council thundered about new offensives, Yamamoto retreated to precision. He adjusted flight schedules, recalculated fuel allocations, rechecked every convoy route. On his desk, the ink barely had time to dry before another order demanded revision. Each change required approval from the Naval Ministry, a process as slow and stubborn as stone. I remember the intervals. 3 weeks for a reply to a request about fuel storage, 17 days for clearance on aircraft transfers. Every delay tightened the noose he'd predicted. The war moved faster than the bureaucracy designed to run it. I watched him navigate that system like a man threading a needle in a storm. He never raised his voice. Instead, he learned to bend the language of compliance until it served him. Requests became reviews, warnings became efficiency assessments. I once saw him spend an entire afternoon rephrasing a single line to make it sound less like a challenge and more like a suggestion. "You can't fight delusion directly," he told me. "You have to make it believe it chose the truth." In the evenings, when the offices emptied and the shouting ceased, he would open the cabinet behind his desk and add another envelope to the growing archive. Each bore his seal and a single initial, Y. I sometimes wondered if he knew I was keeping my own ledger, noting dates, document numbers, the order of his silences. It felt like participating in something forbidden yet necessary, a rebellion built not from explosions, but from record-keeping. Once, I asked him if he thought anyone would ever read them. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides fatigue more than optimism. "If they do," he said, "they'll see we were not blind. Just unheard." His calm unsettled me more than any display of anger could have. Anger seeks change. Silence prepares for consequence. By early March, one of his contingency plans finally cleared approval: a simple reallocation of supply lines toward the Southern Fleet. The authorization arrived stamped and delayed, dated 22 days after his request. He didn't celebrate, he only nodded and said, "Too late for prevention. On time for documentation." That was the moment I understood the difference between being right and being obeyed. One satisfies pride. The other saves lives if it's allowed to. Still, he continued, methodical as ever, while the ministry broadcasted victories that no longer existed outside radio fiction. I saw the contradiction in their eyes. The fear of losing honor outweighing the fear of losing everything else. He didn't despise them for it. "They're prisoners of what they promised," he said quietly, "and so am I." When the lights dimmed each night, the only sound left was the soft crackle of paper being folded and sealed. It was a ritual of preservation, his way of writing the truth into time's margin. The rest of Japan slept beneath slogans, we stayed awake beneath silence. And somewhere in that silence, the cost of being right began to accrue, interest compounding daily, payable in blood we both knew was coming. The night he wrote it, the rain came sideways, tapping the windows like fingers urging him to stop. But he didn't. He sat at the same narrow desk in Rabaul, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the lamplight tracing the ridges of a face too still to be peaceful. The typewriter waited beside him, untouched. This wasn't a document for the archives. It was a confession meant to stay unspoken. He began by hand. The paper was naval stock, thick and faintly blue, already stamped confidential, internal use only. His pen scratched steadily, no hesitations, no corrections. I stood at the doorway, pretending to inventory correspondence, but every keystroke of silence between words felt louder than the rain. When he paused, it wasn't to reconsider, it was to breathe. The words were heavier than orders because they named what everyone feared, that Japan could not win a war of length. It wasn't treason, it was foresight. Yet in that climate, foresight had become dangerous. He'd already watched reports rewritten, supply numbers inflated, telegrams edited to maintain morale. Even truth needed clearance. When he finished the final line, he didn't sign his name. He folded the paper once, sealed it with wax, and wrote on the envelope in English, a habit from his Harvard years. For when reason returns. He handed it to me the next morning with no instruction, just a look that told me everything. I slipped it beneath the lining of my field journal, between the carbon copy of a maintenance log and a photograph of our flight crews. The edges of the envelope caught against the page, leaving a faint crease I can still feel when I run my thumb over it. That was the only record of the memorandum that ever existed. No filing number, no dispatch stamp, no trace in the ministry's routing ledger. It was the order that couldn't be ordered. That day, during the council briefing, I watched as his caution was translated into something unrecognizable. The Minister of War used his projections to justify escalation, quoting his statistics as evidence of confidence rather than concern. Yamamoto sat through it, face calm, eyes down. When the meeting ended, he gathered his papers, thanked the room, and left without a word. I caught up with him in the corridor. "You could correct them," I whispered. He shook his head. "Correction invites censorship. I'd rather let silence keep the record clean." He wasn't being poetic. Censorship then was a blade sheathed in protocol. Every communique passed through 3 offices, every word read by clerks trained to detect disloyalty in syntax. Even a misplaced comma could invite inquiry. He knew that, so he chose absence over alteration. His restraint wasn't fear, it was strategy. Sometimes, the only way to preserve truth is to hide it where arrogance won't think to look. If you've ever known the truth but couldn't say it aloud, you'll understand this part. That sentence has stayed with me, long after the ink faded. Watching him that day taught me that silence, in the right hands, can be louder than any declaration. His unwritten order wasn't meant to stop the inevitable, it was meant to outlast it. Weeks later, I would find him rereading his own notes, as if rehearsing the part history would one day force him to play. "When the reckoning comes," he said softly, "they'll call it fate, but it was policy." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. He was preparing for a future where someone would need proof that he had seen the edge before we stepped off it. By the time the rain returned that evening, the memorandum was gone from his desk. The blotter was clean, the lamp extinguished, the room quiet except for the hum of the generator outside. Yet I could still sense it, the echo of words too honest for daylight. And somewhere beneath the sound of the wind, I thought I heard the faint tear of paper sealing truth from view. The decision had been made, not with defiance, but with the calm precision of inevitability. The noise returned: first orders, parades, the clatter of metals on uniforms. But beneath it, another rhythm began, quieter and exact. Yamamoto never declared his intentions, he distributed them in fragments. A question here, a recalculated distance there. To the War Council, he seemed dutiful, compliant. To those of us close enough to listen between the lines, he was assembling something far more deliberate. It started with the radio decrypts. Every morning, the Communications Division delivered bundles of coded intercepts from the southern stations. Most were routine weather updates, convoy reports, American chatter about supplies, but occasionally, one line would hum with meaning. He taught me to spot the pattern: recurring coordinates, slightly altered time codes, pauses in enemy transmission schedules. "Predictability is a kind of confession," he said once, tracing the numbers with the end of his pen. "They think we're listening, but not understanding. Our task was to understand." He would take the decrypted slips, mark them with red pencil, and cross-check them against fuel records and flight logs. That was how he mapped the invisible shape of the enemy's endurance. The council planned operations like fireworks: spectacular, brief, and wasteful. Yamamoto worked like a clockmaker, adjusting gears until the illusion of control replaced its substance. "We don't need to win," he told me quietly one night, "we need to prove what winning costs." His gamble wasn't recklessness, it was revelation. He designed Operation Igo not as a triumph, but as a test. Every variable: distance, fuel, pilot fatigue, was calibrated to expose the nation's limits. On paper, it read like bold strategy. In practice, it was a mirror turned toward our own exhaustion. I saw it in the requisition sheets. Aircraft fuel marked as delayed, parts scavenged from grounded planes, pilots flying double shifts. The arithmetic was merciless. Yet he never complained. Control, to him, meant clarity within chaos. We met in small offices after hours, under the hum of ceiling fans that smelled of rust and ozone. Aides came and went with sealed folders, none staying long enough to know the full picture. The secrecy wasn't for deception, it was protection. If the council had seen how much he knew, they'd have accused him of defeatism. So he left breadcrumbs. Memoranda phrased in conditional tenses, directives masked as logistical recommendations. He moved through bureaucracy like water through cracks, eroding resistance by persistence alone. The intelligence unit at Truck Lagoon became his silent partner. They handled the aerial reconnaissance photos, grainy shots of American ships assembling farther east than expected. Yamamoto studied them with a ruler, measuring hull lengths, fuel wakes, shadows. He calculated strike range to the meter, margin of error under 2%. The man could turn uncertainty into math. Yet what he was truly calculating was time, the shrinking window before Japan's illusion of control collapsed. The breakthrough came disguised as an error. A young officer brought in a decrypted American message with an unfamiliar preamble. The format was off by 2 characters too small to matter, until Yamamoto noticed it. "This isn't their mistake," he said. "It's their fingerprint." He realized, before anyone else did, that the US had begun reading us back. Our codes, once thought unbreakable, were compromised. It was the moment chaos cracked through his control. He didn't panic. Instead, he grew quieter. The next day, he issued a series of routine route confirmations to his pilots, harmless on paper, but intentionally irregular. It was bait. Within a week, American transmissions referenced those same coordinates. Proof, undeniable. He folded the intercept into his notebook without comment. "Now we know who listens," he said. "The question is whether they'll understand what they hear." His response was the gamble itself, a deliberate exposure. He ordered the inspection tour to the front lines, ostensibly to boost morale, secretly to test the limits of what the enemy knew. If they intercepted his itinerary, the trap would spring. If they didn't, Japan would still see its hero leading from the sky. To the council, it was loyalty. To him, it was a final experiment in truth. The logistics were flawless on paper: 2,700 kilometers, 3 fuel stops, escort formation at staggered altitudes. I helped draft the coordination memos. The approval came swiftly, almost too easily. That was the first sign the Americans were already reading us. Yamamoto didn't mention it. He only signed the orders, handed them back, and said, "Let's see if silence can still move faster than noise." In the following days, the atmosphere thickened with contradictions. The press announced his tour with patriotic flourish, the men prepared with reverence. Yet behind the curtains, I watched him archive one final set of fuel reports and telegram summaries, each labeled with his meticulous handwriting. Receipts again, his private accounting of inevitability. The nation believed he was flying toward glory. I knew he was flying toward proof. Sometimes I wonder if he expected to return. His calm never faltered, but there was a stillness in him that didn't belong to the living, a composure that only comes from acceptance. On the morning of departure, he stood beside the runway, hat in hand, studying the sky like a scholar facing an exam he'd already graded. "Every empire ends," he said softly. "Ours just insists on arriving on time." The engines roared, drowning the dawn in thunder. But even then, his voice lingered, low and unshaken. "History prefers echoes to excuses." I wrote those words down later, in the margin of my own ledger, beneath the date and flight number. Because by then, I understood, control was never about command. It was about seeing the storm clearly, and stepping into it with eyes open. The morning he flew out, the air was too calm. I remember thinking that the sky looked polished, like glass stretched thin over something waiting to break. The crews were efficient, almost reverent, checking gauges, tightening bolts, wiping down fuselages with rags that smelled of fuel and iron. There was no fanfare, only that strange hush before motion. Silence, again, pretending to be peace. I stood beside the radio truck as Yamamoto's plane taxied down the strip. The engines lifted dust in slow spirals. For a second, his hand rose in acknowledgement, nothing grand, just the quiet civility he carried into every impossible day. Then the planes vanished into the horizon, small glints swallowed by the blue. It should have been routine. It wasn't. We received the first transmission 30 minutes later, clear signal, normal altitude. Then another, weaker. Then silence. The operator adjusted the frequency, tapped the gauge, adjusted again. Static. Pure, white static. At first, I thought it was weather interference, but the clouds above Rabaul were flat and harmless. The absence of sound became its own kind of noise. 2 hours later, the coded alert came through. Not from us, from the Americans. They had been waiting, precisely where they needed to be. The intercept report was clinical, almost merciful in its brevity. Enemy formation engaged, primary target destroyed. I read it 3 times before my mind accepted what the words meant. His route, his exact coordinates, had been known in advance. The sky that once hid him had turned witness. Visibility had always been his strength. He could see farther than any of them, anticipate movements like a chess master watching pawns arrange themselves into patterns. But now, that gift had betrayed him. For once, he was the visible one. His foresight had drawn its own target around him. The man who'd mastered silence had been located by noise. The investigation began before his body was recovered. Officers whispered about treachery, about leaks. But deep down, those of us who'd studied the codes knew what had happened. The encryption tables hadn't been updated in months. Requests for replacements had stalled in bureaucratic limbo, marked, pending authorization. It wasn't betrayal, it was negligence dressed as order. The ministry had saved face and lost its future. I was assigned to review the communications log. The evidence was merciless. A message from his aide, transmitted at 0635, using an old cipher. Within minutes, American operators had triangulated it. By 0710, their planes were airborne. By 0745, Yamamoto's formation had been ambushed over Bougainville. He never had a chance to see the enemy. His last recorded message was a brief acknowledgement, proceeding as planned. After that, silence again. The radio room stayed lit through the night. The operators kept scanning for residual frequencies, as if belief alone could summon his voice back through the static. One of them, a boy no older than 20, kept muttering, "He'll call in. He always does." But the channels remained blank, the sky indifferent. When the official confirmation arrived from reconnaissance wreckage located in the jungle, plane identifiable by serial code, no one spoke. Even grief felt too loud. I signed the incident report at dawn. The ink bled slightly on the paper, humidity turning it soft around the edges. My hand didn't shake, but my hearing did. I kept thinking I heard the faint echo of his voice through the static. It wasn't madness. It was memory refusing to adapt to fact. In the following days, the council turned the tragedy into theater. They called him a martyr, a symbol of sacrifice, a legend reborn in air. Newspapers printed his portrait framed by clouds, as if divinity could rewrite incompetence. Yet behind the applause, there was an unease that words couldn't mask. For the first time, the nation sensed its own blindness. The man who had seen too far was gone, and no one else could read the horizon. I was summoned to deliver my findings. One general skimmed the report, frowned, and said, "We cannot release this." Another nodded. It would only damage morale. I understood. Truth, once again, had to be sealed. I folded the pages, placed them in a manila envelope, and wrote on the cover, "For internal retention." That phrase had become our ritual burial ground for inconvenient clarity. That night, I returned to the radio room. The static was still there, soft and endless. I listened for a long time, half expecting a fragment of his voice to slip through a call sign, a syllable, anything. But the silence held, patient and precise, as if waiting for the rest of us to finally understand what he'd known all along. That seeing clearly is not the same as being seen, and that sometimes the sky itself takes sides. He'd warned us once that empires collapse not when they are defeated, but when they stop listening. As I switched off the receiver, the hum faded, leaving only the pulse of my own breath. That was the moment I realized the truth hadn't died with him, it had only become harder to hear. By the time the telegram reached my desk, his ashes were already at sea. The ceremony was brief, state-issued, efficient in the way grief becomes policy. I didn't attend. I sat instead in the records room, where the air smelled of ink, camphor, and the faint metallic tang of paper clips. The memo on top of the stack bore the imperial crest and a single directive stamped in red. Destroy all non-essential correspondence pertaining to Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. Authorization. Section 3, Naval General Staff. It was dated the 24th of June 1943, 67 days after his death. 90 days was the limit for classified material to be refiled or erased. They weren't waiting. I read it twice, then set it aside. Around me, clerks moved quietly, burning carbon copies in small iron bins, stamping void across reports, slicing through cords that had once bound months of calculation together. The sound of paper tearing had its own rhythm, soft, decisive, almost intimate. Yet beneath that ordered destruction, something inside me refused the obedience. I had been his strategist once, his shadow in meetings too crowded with opinions and too thin on foresight. My job had always been to translate his clarity into procedure, and procedure into survival. Even in death, that reflex held. So I began to sort. Not for destruction, but preservation. The letters, the oil logistics, the encrypted drafts, each marked with their naval registry numbers, NRS 41201B through 212 farads. I slipped them into manila envelopes, replacing the identifying seals with older ones salvaged from decommissioned supply files. To the untrained eye, they'd look like routine procurement requests, nothing worth a second glance. Filing them was another problem. The new code index required signatures from 2 officers and an archival timestamp from the Registry Bureau. I couldn't risk attention, so I backdated them to April 10, 8 days before his final flight, and entered them under an obsolete Fleet Coordination Code, FJ-68. That classification had been dormant since the Manchurian exercises. It would pass unnoticed in the quarterly audit. Still, paper leaves trails. The rubber stamp I used was cracked, leaving a faint halo around the kanji for received. The ink bled slightly, enough to draw questions from anyone meticulous. I tested a dozen impressions before settling on one that looked convincingly careless. That detail saved everything. In bureaucracies, imperfection is camouflage. The first true risk came 3 weeks later, when the Naval Censor's Office demanded inventory reconciliation. Every file had to match its registry number and disposition record. I spent 2 nights cross-referencing ledger entries by lamplight, replacing destroyed item logs with near duplicates. The arithmetic was exhausting, but not complex. If 22 reports were marked, purged, then 22 new codes needed to appear elsewhere, quiet substitutions buried in the administrative tide. When the inspectors arrived, they found everything balanced. I remember the officer's signature, Lieutenant Hashida, heavy hand, uneven stroke on the second kanji. He didn't even lift the top sheet, he just nodded and said, "Efficient work, Commander." Efficiency, I'd learned, was another word for silence. But the waiting was worse. 90 days had to pass before the archive seals would be verified and the files officially forgotten. Every morning, I checked the calendar tacked above my desk, crossing off days with the same mechanical calm I'd once used to calculate fuel consumption for long-range missions. Bureaucracy became a kind of penance, precise, slow, and quietly defiant. There were small frictions, of course. A courier ship bound for Truk was delayed by typhoon weather, scattering half our registry receipts into the sea. The replacement documents had to be forged from memory, which meant handwriting the reference codes onto fresh paper at midnight, using a brush so thin it trembled. Another time, a clerk misplaced the supply index where one of the envelopes was hidden. I found it days later wedged behind a radiator, edges curled from heat. I pressed it flat between naval orders until it looked reborn. Each recovery felt like smuggling air. On the 79th day, I visited the outer archive alone. The guards were inattentive, boredom had become their discipline. The room was dim, lined with steel cabinets labeled by fiscal quarter. I slid the preserved files into drawer 43B between fuel expenditures, South Pacific, and communication delays, 1,942. When the metal drawer clicked shut, the sound carried like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Those documents weren't heroic. They were equations, fuel graphs, convoy reports, evidence of how he'd seen the collapse coming line by line, barrel by barrel. To anyone else, they'd look unremarkable, but in their precision lay the entire tragedy. He hadn't been wrong. Just unheard. The official clearance came on the 91st day, stamped with a blue ink seal from the chief archivist's desk. I watched as the record log changed status from active to closed. The files I'd hidden no longer existed in the system. They had survived by vanishing. That night, I walked home through the Naval District. The streets smelled of diesel and low tide. Above the harbor, the horizon was empty, no planes, no sound. Just the hum of generators and the slow slap of water against hulls. For the first time, I understood the shape of his strategy. It had never been about winning a war that couldn't be won. It was about delaying the inevitable long enough for reason to return. I had preserved his logic, but not his life. That distinction would haunt me for years. Every so often, I'd imagine a future historian opening drawer 43B, unfolding those same reports, and realizing how much had been known how early, how clearly. Maybe that would be enough. If you've ever chosen preservation over obedience, you know the cost isn't measured in punishment but in patience. The silence that follows is heavy, but it holds the echo of what was almost lost. As I locked the office for the night, the corridor lights flickered, humming like distant engines. Somewhere, faintly, I thought I heard the sky again. No roar this time, just the low pulse of something waiting to be remembered. The air at truck still smelled of oil and coral, though decades had passed since the engines went silent. Rusted hulls rested beneath the water like sleeping leviathans, their outlines visible when the sun was high enough. I had come to deliver a lecture on naval logistics, but the island had its own memory. Even the breeze seemed to carry old orders. He was waiting for me at the pier. Admiral Saito, one of the last living members of the War Council. Time had hollowed him gently. His shoulders had narrowed, his uniform replaced by a pale summer jacket. When he spoke my name, it wasn't as a reprimand, but as a question long deferred. We sat beneath a weathered awning while the tide crept in. The lagoon was impossibly still, mirror flat, the silence punctured only by the faint click of his lighter. For a long time neither of us spoke. It felt like standing inside the pause between cause and consequence. "You were his aide," he said at last. "You defended his projections." I nodded. There was nothing to correct. He drew in a shallow breath. "You think we were fools?" The answer had lived inside me for years, but I'd never voiced it. "No," I said. "You were patriots. And that's what blinded you." His eyes flickered toward the horizon, a gray line where the ocean met the wreckage of ambition. "He told us the war would end in exhaustion," he murmured. We thought he meant morale. "He meant arithmetic," I replied. "Fuel, steel, pilots. You could win every engagement and still lose the sum." Saito's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his hat. He said it once, after Midway. "We can burn the candle bright, but not long." I laughed then. I thought it was poetry. "It was accounting," I said quietly. For a moment, the sound of the water filled everything. The contrast between what we'd believed and what had been true settled like silt between us, heavy, undeniable. He leaned back, eyes tracing the sky that had once belonged to fighters and scouts. "We built our pride on tempo," he said. "Strike fast, strike first." But endurance, that was the American rhythm. We never learned it. I looked down at the water, where the shadows of wrecked carriers lay mapped across the sand. "That was the truth," he knew, I said finally. "Japan could win battles, but not the war of endurance." He tried to force the reckoning early, before the nation bled itself dry. But foresight looks like treason to those still marching. Saito's lighter clicked shut. "And to those who stayed silent?" I met his gaze. "Silence isn't absence. It's preservation. Some truths survive better unspoken until the world is ready to hear them." The lagoon shimmered with that strange, deceptive calm, the kind that comes after too much noise. Above us, seaplanes from the modern fleet droned distantly, smaller, faster, but carrying the same arrogance in their flight paths. History never repeated, it just rhymed, faintly, across new machinery. Saito rose slowly, joints stiff, eyes glistening not from sentiment but recognition. "He warned us," he said, almost to himself. And we buried the warning along with him. I stood beside him, the sand warm beneath my shoes. "Not entirely," I said. "Some records survived." He didn't ask how. Perhaps he already knew. As the sun dipped, the rusted masts caught the light, flaring gold before sinking into dusk. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding, the quiet after denial finally exhales. When we parted, he extended his hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of years spent defending the indefensible. I took it. No victory, no apology, just the brief alignment of two men who had seen too much from opposite sides of conviction. Walking back along the pier, I realized the open loop had closed not with vindication, but with clarity. Yamamoto's truth had outlived him, carried in wreckage and whispers, steady as the tide reclaiming the steel. The lagoon held it all. Noise turned to stillness, failure turned to foresight. Behind me, the waves rose and fell, soft as breath. For the first time in decades, I let them carry the silence without resistance. The courier arrived just after dawn, his shoes damp from the tide that crept up the pier overnight. I handed him the sealed crate, plain cedar, unmarked, its contents arranged with the same precision I once reserved for deployment charts. Inside lay the life I'd hidden. Yamamoto's projections, fuel tables, encrypted drafts. Each document bore its own chain of custody label, notarized and stamped for transfer to the International Naval Archive in Geneva. It was, in essence, a surrender. But not to an enemy, only to time. The process was colder than I expected. 3 forms for export authorization, 2 for provenance verification, and 1 for moral distance. A declaration that I sought no restitution, no ownership. The clerk at the embassy counter barely looked up as she signed the release. Material of historical significance, she murmured, not state property. Just like that, 40 years of silence became public record. Transparency had no ceremony. At the dock, I watched the crate disappear into the ship's hold. The ocean accepted it without judgment, the same way it had accepted so many wrecks before. I thought of the papers surviving all those years, ink holding its line against humidity, salt, and bureaucracy. Secrecy had protected them, now transparency would preserve them. The contrast stung, yet it felt right. Control meant nothing without release. The archivist's letter arrived 6 months later. The documents had passed initial authentication and were scheduled for digitization under accession number GA11342. These materials, she wrote, offer valuable insight into early dissent within wartime Japan. Her words were clinical, detached. But between the lines, I saw what mattered, his logic, no longer confined to whispers. The truth had found a legal form. There was a waiting period, of course 180 days before declassification could be announced publicly. I spent them by the sea, walking the same shoreline where our ships had once departed in formation. The ocean hadn't changed, it still reflected everything, even the parts we'd rather not see. Each morning, fishermen mended their nets near the memorial stones, quiet in their rhythm. I envied that peace, the kind that comes from living with the tide, not against it. When the confirmation finally came, a printed notice in the International Bulletin, I folded it once and slid it into my coat pocket. No celebration, no headlines. Just the steady knowledge that what had been hidden was now traceable, verifiable, accountable. History doesn't need confession, it needs documentation. Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's recorded. The sea stretched wide and unhurried before me, its horizon drawn clean as a ledger line. I felt the boundary settle between duty and closure, secrecy and sunlight. My silence had done its work, now the archives would speak in my place. The waves rose, broke, and folded back into themselves, carrying the sound of paper turning to memory. By evening, the horizon had thinned into gold. The tide moved without urgency, brushing the pilings with the same rhythm I remembered from decades ago when orders carried across the water like scripture. The ships were gone, of course. Only gulls circled now, tracing wide, patient arcs over the wrecks below. Their cries echoed once, then folded into stillness. It wasn't emptiness, it was completion. I stood at the same shoreline where Yamamoto had once watched the fleet depart, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the line between sea and sky. I remember that morning, the noise of engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the applause from officers who believed in thunder. They mistook volume for power. He knew better. His strength had always been measured in quiet, the calm arithmetic of endurance. Now, the silence he carried had returned, vast and unbroken. The contrast struck me. Then, the roar of departure. Now, the hush of understanding. Loss had not erased legacy. It had clarified it. The sea had become what it always promised to be, a ledger that kept its own accounts, unblinking, incorruptible. I thought of the files now resting in Geneva, no longer contraband but curriculum. Students would read his calculations, trace his logic, see the caution encoded in every line. His voice, once silenced, now spoke through numbers, through margins and footnotes. That was the quiet victory he never lived to witness. I sat on a weathered rock, notebook in hand. The pages fluttered lightly, catching the wind like hesitant sails. For years, I'd avoided writing anything personal. Words felt dangerous, like sparks in a powder room. But time had shifted the risk. Reflection was no longer rebellion. It was duty. The first line I wrote came slowly. Strategic humility, the art of knowing when foresight must bow to fate. It wasn't philosophy, just observation distilled from regret. I outlined the book in the same disciplined tone he once used in his memoranda, methodical, unsentimental, precise. It wouldn't glorify him. It would study him as a man who saw too far and spoke too softly for the age he lived in. As the light faded, I traced the edge of the water with my shoe. Each wave erased the mark before it settled, yet the movement itself left memory in the sand. Legacy works that way, seen, then gone, yet never lost. I had spent a lifetime guarding silence, now I understood it as language. Across the bay, children were playing near the shallows, their laughter thin but persistent. I found comfort in that noise, reborn, unburdened. The world moves on. It should. We record, we release, and we let the tide decide what remains. I closed the notebook and looked toward the open water. The horizon had deepened into indigo, the last of the light trembling where sky met sea. For the first time, I didn't see ruin or warning. I saw continuity, a long line of cause and comprehension stretching forward. They called it surrender. I call it foresight fulfilled. And with that, I let the silence stand, unchallenged, complete.